David Weston's mind was still swirling with the aftermath of the intense business meeting as he exited his sleek black car. The New York streets were buzzing with life, the cool evening breeze brushing past him as he strolled toward his favorite cafe to unwind. But something made him pause, a voice, ethereal and haunting, cutting through the city's noise like a beacon. He turned, searching for the source. There, on the corner of 52nd and Madison, was a young girl, maybe 18, with a battered guitar in her hands. Her voice was angelic, raw, and filled with a depth of emotion that captivated him instantly. She sang as if the words were a lifeline, a desperate cry that resonated deep within his soul. A small crowd had gathered, but no one seemed to truly see her, to understand the magnitude of the talent standing before them. David's gaze fell to the cardboard sign propped up next to her. In hastily scrawled letters, it read, "Please help. My grandmother is sick, and we're losing our home." The words struck him like a blow. He took a step closer, his business instincts battling with a surge of compassion he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just her voice. It was the look in her eyes, determined, yet fragile. A look he had seen before, a long time ago. As the song ended, the girl, and, as he would soon learn, lowered her head, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the fraying strap of her guitar. The crowd dispersed, leaving a few coins and crumpled bills in her open guitar case. David watched as she carefully counted the money, her shoulders sagging in disappointment. Without thinking, he moved forward. "That was beautiful," he said, his voice surprising even himself, and looked up, her eyes wide with a mixture of wariness and hope. "Thank you, sir," she replied, her voice soft but steady. There was something in the way she spoke, a quiet strength that belied her vulnerable appearance. "What's your name?" David asked, crouching down to be at her level. He noticed the dark circles under her eyes, the way she clutched the guitar as if it were her only possession. "Anne," she said simply, glancing down at her sign. "I'm just trying to get by. My grandmother. She's all I have left." The sincerity in her voice tugged at something deep within him. He had been around countless musicians, seen countless performances, but this was different. There was a purity, a desperation in her music that he hadn't encountered in years. "Look in," he began, hesitating. He could almost hear his business partner's voice in his head, cautioning him against getting involved in something like this. But he pushed it aside. "I want to help. You shouldn't be out here, especially at this time of night. Let me get you and your grandmother somewhere safe." Her eyes widened, surprise flickering across her face. "You don't have to do that, sir. We're okay." But the lie was evident in the way her voice cracked, the way she couldn't meet his gaze. David shook his head. "I insist. No one should be out here like this. Let me help, just for tonight." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a business card. "I'm David Weston. I have an apartment nearby. You can stay there until we figure something out," and hesitated, glancing at the card before taking it gingerly. "David Weston?" she repeated, recognition flashing in her eyes. "The music producer?" He nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Yes, that's me. And I'd be honored if you'd let me help you. I promise, no strings attached." She bit her lip, looking torn. The struggle was clear on her face. Trust was something she couldn't afford lightly. But there was something in his demeanor, a genuine concern that made her want to believe him. "Okay," she whispered finally, her voice barely audible over the hum of the city. "Just for tonight." David nodded, relief washing over him. "Just for tonight," he agreed softly, as they walked towards his car and glanced back at her guitar case, hesitating. David noticed and turned back, bending down to gather the few coins and bills. "You'll need this," he said, handing her the money. "For your grandmother." Her eyes welled up with unshed tears, and she quickly looked away, murmuring a quiet thank you. David felt a pang of sadness as he watched her. What had life done to this young girl to make her so wary, so broken? They reached his car, and David opened the door for her. As she settled into the plush leather seat, she held her guitar close, as if it were a shield protecting her from the unfamiliar luxury around her. David got in and started the engine, glancing over at her. "You don't have to be afraid," he said gently. I know this is overwhelming, but I just want to help. And nodded, though her grip on the guitar didn't loosen. Thank you, Mr. Weston. I don't know why you're doing this, but thank you. David's heart ached at her words. He didn't know either. Maybe it was her voice, or perhaps it was the ghosts of his past that haunted him. But one thing was clear. He wasn't going to let this girl slip through the cracks. Not if he could help it. As they drove through the illuminated city streets, neither spoke. The silence between them was heavy, but not uncomfortable. More like a shared understanding that, for tonight at least, they were both just two lost souls trying to find a way forward. The night held its breath as the city blurred past them, and David couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. He had no idea how much his life was about to change, and neither did Anne. David guided the car into the underground parking garage of his upscale building. The drive had been quiet, and he could sense Anne's tension, the way she clutched her guitar like a lifeline. As they stepped out, she glanced around the luxurious surroundings, her expression a mix of awe and apprehension. He tried to ease her discomfort with a smile. It's not much, but it's home. And gave a small, nervous laugh, shaking her head. Not much? This place is amazing. David's smile softened. Come on, let me show you where you'll be staying. As they entered the penthouse, Anne's eyes widened at the expansive view of the city skyline, the modern decor, and the soft, ambient lighting that made the space feel welcoming. David led her to a guest room at the end of the hall, opening the door to reveal a cozy space with a large bed, warm lighting, and abstract art on the walls. This is yours for as long as you need, he said gently. There are fresh towels in the bathroom and some clothes in the closet that should fit you. And hesitated in the doorway, her gaze darting between the room and David, as if she couldn't believe it was real. I don't know how to thank you, she whispered, her voice trembling. No one's ever done something like this for me. David felt a lump form in his throat. He knew the world could be harsh, especially to someone like her. You don't have to thank me, he said softly. Just get some rest. We can talk more tomorrow. She nodded, still looking uncertain, but she stepped into the room, setting her guitar down carefully. Thank you, she murmured again, almost to herself, as if trying to convince herself that this was really happening. David gave her a reassuring smile and stepped back, pulling the door closed behind him. As he walked away, he felt a wave of emotions crash over him. Anger, sadness, guilt. What kind of life had she been living to make her so wary, so used to fending for herself? He found himself in his office, staring at an old photograph on his desk, his late wife, Laura, holding a baby, their daughter. His heart ached as he remembered the day the picture was taken, the joy on Laura's face, the dreams they had for their child. But those dreams had shattered with the car crash that had taken both Laura and, he had believed, his daughter. His mind raced with thoughts he hadn't allowed himself to entertain in years. Could Anne really be his daughter? The possibility seemed too unreal, too painful to even consider. But there was something about her, something that felt familiar, that called out to him in a way he couldn't ignore. He ran a hand over his face, the weight of the years and the ghosts of the past pressing down on him. He knew he needed answers, but he was terrified of what he might find. He had to know who Anne really was, but he wasn't sure if he was ready to face the truth. The hours slipped by as he wrestled with his thoughts. Finally, just as the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, he made a decision. He would do whatever it took to protect her, to make sure she was safe. But first, he needed to know the truth. Just as he was about to head to bed, a soft melody drifted down the hallway. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. It was the same song Anne had sung on the street, the lullaby he had written for his daughter. He moved quietly down the hall, drawn by the music, and stopped at the open door of the guest room, and sat on the bed, her eyes closed, strumming her guitar softly as she sang the lullaby, her voice pure and unblemished. The sight hit David like a punch to the gut. It was a song he hadn't heard in years, a song he had written for his daughter, the daughter he thought he had lost. Where did you learn that song? The question slipped out before he could stop himself. Anne's eyes snapped open, fear flashing across her face as she turned to see him standing in the doorway. I don't know, she stammered, clutching the guitar tighter. I've just always known it. My grandmother used to sing it to me when I was little. David's heart raced. Your grandmother? And what's your last name? She hesitated, confusion clouding her gaze. It's Collins. And Collins. The name was like a key turning in a lock, releasing a flood of memories and emotions. Laura's maiden name had been Collins. He felt his legs nearly give out as he realized the truth he had been so afraid to face. This was his daughter. His daughter was alive. He stumbled back, gripping the doorframe for support, and jumped up, alarmed, setting the guitar aside as she reached out. Are you okay? She asked, her voice trembling. David forced himself to breathe, to focus. He couldn't break down now, not when she was standing right in front of him. And, I think I'm your father, he whispered, his voice cracking. She stared at him, her face pale, eyes wide. What? No, that's not possible. My father died before I was born. He shook his head, feeling tears prick at his eyes. No, Anne, that's not true. I thought you died with your mother in an accident 10 years ago. Her breath hitched, confusion giving way to anger and fear. No, you're wrong. My mother and grandmother raised me. My father, he was never in the picture. David took a step closer, desperation in his voice. Please, Anne, there's so much you don't know. No, she shouted, backing away. This is crazy. You're not my father. You can't be. Her reaction cut through him like a knife. He reached out, his hand trembling. I know it's a lot to take in, but I swear, I'm telling the truth. Please, just let me explain. But she shook her head furiously, tears streaming down her face. I don't know you. I don't want to know you. She turned and ran from the room, leaving David standing there, his heart breaking all over again. He had found his daughter, but she was slipping through his fingers before he even had the chance to hold her. As he stood there, the sound of her sobs echoing down the hall, he vowed that he wouldn't let her go. No matter what it took, he would prove to her who he was, and he would make up for all the lost years. He had lost her once. He wasn't going to lose her again. David barely slept that night, his mind a whirlwind of emotions and unanswered questions. As the first light of dawn filtered through the windows, he made himself a promise. He would find a way to reach Anne, to prove to her that he was telling the truth. After a restless morning, he decided to take the first step. He reached for his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years, a number that connected him to his former business partner and lifelong friend, Michael Turner. If anyone could help him dig into Anne's past and confirm what he already knew in his heart, it was Michael. David. Michael's voice was groggy and confused. Is that you? Yeah, it's me, David replied, trying to keep his voice steady. I need a favor, Michael. It's urgent. There was a pause on the other end, and then Michael's voice sharpened, alert now. What's going on? David hesitated, then took a deep breath. I think I found my daughter. Silence filled the line for a long moment. When Michael spoke again, his voice was careful, measured. David, we've been through this before. You know the investigations led nowhere. I don't want to see you go through that pain again. I know what you're thinking, but this time it's different, David said, his voice urgent. I met her. She's real, Michael, and I'm almost certain she's my daughter, but I need to be sure. Michael sighed, the sound of papers rustling on the other end. All right, I'll see what I can do. Give me everything you know, and I'll start looking into it. David relayed what little information he had. Anne's full name, her grandmother's details, anything that could help piece together her past. When he hung up, he felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Determined to give in some space, he decided to step out for a while, leaving a note on the kitchen counter. I'm out for a bit. Take your time. We can talk when you're ready. When he returned later that afternoon, he found her in the living room, sitting stiffly on the edge of the couch. She looked up as he entered, her expression guarded. Hey, he said softly, keeping his distance. I didn't want to overwhelm you. I just needed to clear my head. And nodded, but she didn't relax. I've been thinking about what you said last night. Her voice was steady, but he could hear the tremor underneath. I don't know if I believe you. But I need to know the truth. I need to understand what's going on. David felt his heart lift with cautious hope. I'll do whatever it takes to show you I'm telling the truth, he promised. We can talk to your grandmother, get answers, whatever you need. And glanced away, her fingers twisting in her lap. I called her this morning. She's on her way here now. David's breath caught. This was his chance, their chance, to finally uncover what had happened all those years ago. All right, he said, keeping his voice calm. We'll figure this out together. They waited in tense silence, the minutes dragging by until the doorbell rang. David's heart pounded as he opened the door to reveal an older woman with silver hair and tired eyes, Mrs. Collins. She looked at him with a mixture of wariness and resentment before turning her gaze to Anne. Grandma, and said softly, stepping forward, I need you to tell me the truth. About everything. Mrs. Collins sighed, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of the years had finally caught up with her. She glanced at David again, her eyes narrowing. What did you tell her? She asked sharply. I told her what I know, David replied, his voice firm. That she's my daughter. That I thought she died with her mother. Mrs. Collins shook her head, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and anger. You don't understand, David. You never did. Laura was trying to protect her, to protect you both. There were people, dangerous people, who would have stopped at nothing to find her. Who? David demanded, stepping forward. Who were they? The older woman's face tightened, and she glanced at Anne, her eyes softening. Your mother found out things she shouldn't have, about her family, about people who were involved in terrible things. She tried to leave, to take you and start over, but they wouldn't let her. When she realized they were coming after her, she made a plan. She wanted you to be safe, and even if it meant you thought your father was gone. Anne's face went pale, her hands trembling as she hugged herself. But why did you lie to me? Why did you make me believe he didn't want me? Mrs. Collins's eyes filled with tears. Because I was afraid. I thought if you knew the truth, you would go looking for him, and that would have put you in danger. I did what I thought was best, but I see now that I was wrong. I just wanted to keep you safe. David felt his heart breaking as he watched and struggled to process everything. He took a step closer, his voice gentle. I swear to you, and if I had known you were alive, I would have moved heaven and earth to find you. And looked at him, her eyes filled with confusion and pain. I don't know what to believe, she whispered. All these years, I thought I was alone. I know, David said softly, his voice thick with emotion. But you're not alone anymore. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. For a long moment, the room was silent, the weight of the past pressing down on all of them. Then Anne took a deep breath, lifting her chin. I need to know everything, she said, her voice steady. I need to understand what happened to my mother, why she was so scared. Mrs. Collins nodded slowly, resignation in her eyes. All right, but it's a long story, and it's not one I ever wanted you to hear. David and Anne sat down on the couch, bracing themselves as the older woman began to speak, her voice soft and filled with pain. Your mother, Laura, grew up in a world you can't imagine, Mrs. Collins began. Her family was involved in all sorts of illegal activities, money laundering, fraud, things that could ruin lives. When she was young, she tried to break free, but they pulled her back in. When she met your father, she saw a chance to start over, to build a life away from them. But they weren't going to let her go that easily. David's heart ached as he listened, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Laura had been trying to protect them, to escape a life of danger and deceit. And she had paid the ultimate price for it. When you were born, she thought she could keep you safe. But then she found out something so dangerous that she knew she had to run. Mrs. Collins continued, her voice trembling. She never told me what it was, only that if they knew she had it, they would stop at nothing to find her. That's when she made the plan, the one that would keep you hidden. Anne's eyes were wide, her face pale. What was it? What did she have? Mrs. Collins shook her head. I don't know. All I know is that after the accident, I had to make sure you stayed hidden. I took you and ran, made everyone believe you both were gone. It was the only way to keep you safe. David's heart pounded as he looked at Anne, her expression a mix of shock and determination. "Whatever it was, we need to find out," he said, his voice firm. "If there's something out there that could help us understand what happened to your mother, we need to find it." Mrs. Collins hesitated, then nodded slowly. "There's a storage unit. Laura rented it just before the accident. I never went there. I was too afraid. But it might have something, some clue." David stood, his heart racing. "We'll go tomorrow. We'll find out what she was hiding, and we'll finally get some answers." And looked up at him, her eyes filled with a fierce determination. "I'm coming with you. I need to know the truth." David nodded, his heart swelling with pride. She was strong, so much stronger than he could have ever imagined. "We'll do this together." As they made their plans, a sense of hope began to build in David's chest. For the first time in years, he felt like he was on the right path, like he was finally taking steps to set things right. But as he looked at Anne, the pain and confusion still etched on her face, he knew they were only at the beginning. The road ahead was long, and the dangers they faced were real. But no matter what, he would protect her. He would keep her safe. Because no matter what they found in that storage unit, they were in this together. And together, they would face whatever came next. The next morning, David woke up with a sense of urgency he hadn't felt in years. After a quick breakfast, he and Anne prepared to head to the storage unit Mrs. Collins had mentioned. There was a tense silence between them as they drove through the city, each lost in their thoughts. The previous night's revelations had left them both reeling, and the reality of their situation was beginning to sink in. David stole a glance at Anne. She sat quietly beside him, her gaze fixed out the window, her face pale but resolute. He wished he could take away her pain, her confusion, but he knew the only way forward was to confront the truth, no matter how painful it might be. When they arrived at the storage facility, a nondescript building on the outskirts of town, David's heart pounded with a mixture of anticipation and dread. He led the way to the unit, his hands shaking slightly as he unlocked the door. The air inside was stale, the faint scent of dust and old cardboard lingering in the small space. The unit was packed with boxes, some labeled with vague descriptions like books or clothes. But in the center was a single metal filing cabinet, its drawers closed and locked. "This has to be it," David murmured, moving to the cabinet. He tried one of the drawers, but it wouldn't budge. "It's locked," and reached into her bag and pulled out a small key. "Grandma gave me this," she said quietly. "She said it was for the cabinet." David took the key, his heart racing as he fitted into the lock and turned. With a soft click, the drawer slid open, revealing a collection of files, some old, others more recent. He flipped through them quickly, his eyes scanning the labels until he found what he was looking for. A folder marked Sinclair. "This is it," he said, pulling out the folder and opening it. Inside were documents, photos, and handwritten notes, all detailing a network of corruption, criminal activities, and illegal transactions. But at the heart of it all was a name, Kenneth Sinclair, and leaned over his shoulder, her eyes wide as she read over his arm. "This is everything," she whispered. "Everything Mom was hiding from?" David nodded, his mind racing as he absorbed the information. Sinclair was involved in money laundering, corporate espionage, even human trafficking. He had powerful connections in law enforcement and politics, making him nearly untouchable. But Laura had gathered enough evidence to bring him down. If they could get it to the right people. "She knew they would come after her," David said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "That's why she tried to run. She wanted to protect you." Anne's face twisted with a mix of anger and sadness. "All this time, I thought she was just overprotective, paranoid. But she was fighting to keep me safe." David reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. "We're going to finish what she started, Anne. We're going to take this to the authorities, make sure Sinclair pays for what he's done." And looked up at him, her eyes filled with a fierce determination. "I'm in, whatever it takes." David felt a surge of pride and love for his daughter. Despite everything she'd been through, she was standing strong, ready to face the darkness that had taken so much from her. They spent the next few hours going through the rest of the documents, carefully cataloging everything they found. There were names, dates, locations, enough evidence to tie Sinclair and his associates to a string of crimes that spanned decades. But as they delved deeper, David couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something, some crucial piece that tied it all together. Then he found it, an envelope tucked at the back of the drawer, its edges worn and faded. Inside was a single piece of paper with a series of numbers and letters scrawled across it in Laura's handwriting. Beneath it, in bold, underlined script, were the words, "In case something happens to me, this will lead you to the truth." "What is this?" Anne asked, peering over his shoulder. David shook his head, his mind racing. "I'm not sure. It looks like a code, but I don't know what it means." And frowned, staring at the paper. Maybe it's an address? Or coordinates? David studied the numbers again. It didn't look like any address he'd ever seen, but it could be coordinates. Or it could be something else entirely. Whatever it is, it's important. We need to figure it out. They packed up the files, making sure to keep the envelope separate. As they left the storage unit, David's mind was already working, trying to piece together what Laura had left behind. There was more to this than just the evidence in the files. Laura had known something big, something dangerous, and she had left this clue as a way to find it. As they drove back to the city, David called Michael, his voice tense with urgency. "Michael, we found something. A code, maybe coordinates. I need you to take a look at it." Michael agreed to meet them at David's apartment. When they arrived, he was already there, his expression grave as he looked over the documents they had brought back. "This is big, David," he said, his voice low. "If we can prove even half of this, it could bring Sinclair's entire operation down." David nodded, his heart pounding. "What about the code? Do you recognize it?" Michael studied the paper for a long moment, then shook his head. "It doesn't look like any code I've seen before, but I know some people who might be able to crack it. We need to move fast, though. If Sinclair gets wind of this..." He didn't finish the sentence, but David didn't need him to. He knew exactly what would happen if Sinclair found out they had the evidence. They had to act quickly, carefully. "Do it," David said. "Whatever it takes." Michael nodded and took the paper, promising to get back to them as soon as he had something. After he left, David and Anne sat in the living room, the weight of everything they had discovered pressing down on them. "What if we're too late?" Anne asked quietly, her voice trembling. "What if he finds out before we can stop him?" David reached over, taking her hand in his. "We're not too late. We have the truth, and we have each other. That's more than he's got. We're going to finish this, Anne. We're going to make sure he never hurts anyone again." She nodded, but her eyes were filled with fear and uncertainty. David's heart ached as he watched her, the strength she had shown earlier now giving way to the fear and exhaustion that had been building for days. "Hey," he said softly, squeezing her hand. "We're going to be okay. I promise." And looked at him, her eyes searching his. "Do you really believe that?" David hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, I believe it." They sat there in silence, the city lights casting a soft glow through the windows. Outside, life went on as usual, people unaware of the storm that was brewing, the dark forces that were gathering. But inside, in the quiet of the penthouse, a father and daughter held on to each other, refusing to let go, refusing to give up. Because no matter how dark the night, they would face it together. And together, they would find a way to bring the truth to light. The next few days were a blur of activity. David and Anne spent hours poring over the documents they had recovered, trying to piece together the tangled web of Sinclair's operations. Michael was working with his contacts to decode the mysterious note Laura had left, but progress was slow, and the tension was starting to take its toll on everyone. David could see the strain in Anne's eyes, the way she seemed to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders. She barely slept, her nights filled with restless dreams that left her exhausted and on edge. He wanted to help her, to shield her from the darkness that had taken so much from their family, but he knew there was no way to protect her from the truth. One afternoon, as they sat in the living room surrounded by stacks of papers and files, Anne suddenly slammed her hand down on the table, her eyes blazing with frustration. "This is impossible," she cried, pushing a pile of documents away. "It's like every time we find one piece of the puzzle, 3 more show up. How are we supposed to stop him if we can't even figure out what he's doing? David reached out, placing a hand on her arm. I know it feels overwhelming, but we're making progress. Every piece of information we find is another step closer to bringing Sinclair down. And shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. But what if it's not enough? What if no one believes us? He's so powerful, Dad. What if we can't stop him? David felt his heart ache at the desperation in her voice. He wanted to tell her everything would be okay, that they would win, but he knew she needed more than empty promises. She needed a plan, a reason to believe that they could actually succeed. We're not alone in this, Anne, he said gently. We have Michael, and he has connections. Once we crack that code, we'll have everything we need to take Sinclair down. And sniffed, wiping at her eyes. I'm so tired. Tired of running. Tired of being scared. I want this to be over. David pulled her into a hug, holding her close. I know, and it will be. We just have to keep going a little longer. They stayed like that for a long time, drawing strength from each other. David knew that this was their chance, perhaps their only chance, to put an end to the nightmare that had haunted their family for so long. But he also knew they were running out of time. Later that evening, as they were sorting through yet another stack of papers, Michael called. David's heart leapt as he answered, his voice tight with anticipation. Tell me you have something. I do, Michael replied, his voice grim. It's a set of coordinates, David. They lead to an address in upstate New York, a private estate owned by a shell company linked to Sinclair. It's heavily guarded, but if there's anything Laura was trying to hide from him, it's probably there. David's mind raced. A private estate, hidden away in the middle of nowhere. It was exactly the kind of place Sinclair would use to keep his secrets. Do you think we can get in? It won't be easy, Michael admitted, but I've got a contact who can get us access to the security systems. It's risky, though. If Sinclair finds out we're coming, he won't, David said firmly. We'll be careful. Michael hesitated, then sighed. All right, I'll set it up. But David, be careful. This isn't just some corporate takedown. These people are dangerous. I know, David said, his voice steady. We'll be ready. He hung up and turned to Anne, who was watching him with a mixture of fear and determination. We have a lead, he said, his voice filled with a cautious hope. A place where Sinclair might be keeping whatever it was your mother found. Anne's eyes widened. You mean, like evidence? Proof of what he's done? David nodded. It's possible. Whatever it is, Laura thought it was important enough to hide it from him. We're going to find it. A flicker of hope crossed Anne's face, but it was quickly replaced by worry. What if it's a trap? What if he's waiting for us? We'll be careful, David promised. We'll take every precaution. But this is our best shot, Anne. We can't pass it up. She took a deep breath, then nodded, her jaw set with determination. I'm coming with you. David felt a surge of pride and fear at her words. He wanted to protect her, to keep her away from the danger they were about to face, but he knew better than to argue. She was as much a part of this as he was, and she deserved to see it through. Okay, he said softly. We'll do this together. They spent the next few hours preparing, going over the layout of the estate and the security measures Michael had provided. David knew it was a long shot, but they had to try. If they could find whatever Laura had hidden, it could be the key to bringing Sinclair down for good. The drive to the estate was tense and silent. The dark, winding road seemed to close in around them, the shadows of the trees stretching out like grasping fingers. David's mind was a whirl of plans and contingencies, each one more desperate than the last. When they finally arrived at the edge of the property, they parked the car a safe distance away and made their way through the woods on foot. The estate loomed ahead of them, a dark silhouette against the night sky. David's heart pounded as they crouched in the underbrush, scanning the perimeter for any signs of movement. There, Anne whispered, pointing to a small building near the edge of the estate. That's where the security system is controlled, right? David nodded. We need to disable it before we go any further. If we can shut down the cameras, we'll have a clear path to the main house. They moved cautiously through the shadows, their breaths coming in short, tense bursts. David's mind was focused on the task ahead, his nerves strung tight. He knew they were taking a huge risk, but there was no turning back now. As they reached the security building, David pulled out the small device Michael had given him, a jammer designed to disrupt the estate's surveillance network. He activated it, watching as the lights on the control panel flickered and died. "We're in," he whispered, his voice tight with relief. "Let's go." They made their way to the main house, sticking to the shadows as they approached the back entrance. David's heart raced as he carefully picked the lock, the click of the tumblers sounding impossibly loud in the still night air. The door swung open, revealing a dimly lit hallway lined with ornate paintings and polished woodwork. David and Anne slipped inside, their footsteps silent on the plush carpet. David's mind raced as they moved deeper into the house, searching for any sign of whatever Laura had hidden. They found it in a small study on the second floor. Behind a bookshelf, David discovered a hidden safe, its door slightly ajar. Inside was a single, worn notebook, its pages filled with Laura's handwriting. David's hands shook as he pulled it out, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, Laura's last message, her final attempt to protect her family. He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the cramped script. It was a detailed account of everything she had discovered about Sinclair. His crimes, his connections, the people he had bought and blackmailed. But there was more, something darker. "She found out about a shipment," David murmured, his voice hoarse with shock. "A shipment of people. Trafficking. She tried to stop it, but they found out. That's why they came after her." Anne's face was pale, her eyes wide with horror. She was trying to save them. That's why she ran. David nodded, his heart breaking as he imagined the fear and desperation Laura must have felt. She knew they would kill her if they found out. So she hid this, hoping someone would find it. He turned to the last page, his breath catching in his throat as he read the final, hastily scrawled words. "David, if you're reading this, it means they found me. Keep her safe. I love you." David closed the notebook, his hands trembling. Laura had known she was going to die, and she had left this final plea, this last act of defiance, to protect their daughter. "We have to go," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "We have to get this to Michael. It's everything we need." But as they turned to leave, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. David's heart stopped as he saw a shadow move outside the door. "Dad!" Anne whispered, fear tightening her voice. David grabbed her hand, pulling her towards the back of the study. "There's a window. We can get out that way." They moved quickly, their breaths coming in short, sharp gasps as they climbed out the window and onto the roof. Below them, the estate was alive with movement. Guards swarming the grounds, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. "We need to get to the car," David whispered, his mind racing. "If we can make it back to the woods, we can lose them." But as they made their way along the roof, a voice called out behind them. "Stop right there." David turned, his heart pounding as he saw a man step out of the shadows, a gun in his hand. It was one of Sinclair's men, his face twisted with anger. "Run, Anne," David shouted, shoving her towards the edge of the roof. "Go," and hesitated, her eyes wide with fear, but then she turned and scrambled down the drain pipe. David followed, his mind racing as he hit the ground and grabbed her hand, pulling her towards the tree-line. Behind them, the guards were shouting, their footsteps pounding on the gravel path. David's heart pounded as they sprinted through the woods, the dark shapes of the trees flashing past them. They ran until they could run no more, collapsing behind a fallen log, their chests heaving with exhaustion. David's mind raced, the weight of what they had found crashing down on him. "We did it," he panted, his voice filled with a mix of relief and fear. "We have what we need. We can take him down." And nodded, her face pale but determined. "We have to get this to Michael. He'll know what to do." David glanced around, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of pursuit. "We need to keep moving. We're not safe yet." They stumbled to their feet, their legs shaking with exhaustion as they made their way back to the car. As they drove away, David's mind was already working, planning their next move. They had the evidence, but now they had to survive long enough to use it. Sinclair wouldn't let them go easily, and David knew they were about to face their greatest challenge yet. But no matter what happened, He would protect his daughter. He would honor Laura's last wish, and he would make sure that Sinclair paid for everything he had done. Because this was more than just a fight for justice. It was a fight for their family, for the future they had lost. And David Weston wasn't going to lose again. As they sped away from Sinclair's estate, David's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind racing through their next steps. The notebook sat on the seat between them, Laura's final message like a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. They had the proof they needed, but now the real battle began. Getting it to the right people without getting themselves killed in the process. And was silent beside him, her gaze fixed on the dark road ahead. He glanced over at her, seeing the exhaustion etched into her features, the fear that still lingered in her eyes. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, and nodded, but her voice was strained. I can't believe it's really happening. That we have something that could actually stop him." David reached over, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. "We're going to make it, Anne. We'll get this to Michael, and he'll know what to do." But even as he spoke the words, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Sinclair had resources, connections. He would know they had been at the estate, and he wouldn't rest until he found them. They drove through the night, their route winding and indirect to avoid detection. As dawn broke, they pulled into a secluded gas station off the highway. David filled the tank, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of trouble. When he returned to the car, he handed Anne a bottle of water and a sandwich. "Eat something," he urged gently. "We need to keep our strength up." And took the sandwich, but she barely nibbled at it, her mind clearly elsewhere. "What if he finds out what we have?" she asked quietly. "What if he comes after us?" David's heart ached at the fear in her voice. "He won't," he said firmly, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. "We're going to stay ahead of him. Michael is arranging a safe place for us to lay low. We just have to get there." And nodded, but her eyes were distant, lost in thoughts he couldn't reach. He wished he could do more, say something that would ease her fear, but the truth was they were in more danger now than ever. Sinclair wouldn't hesitate to use every tool at his disposal to silence them, and they had to be ready. They continued driving, the miles slipping away beneath the tires. As the hours passed, David's exhaustion began to weigh on him. He knew they needed to rest, to regroup, but stopping felt like tempting fate. Finally, as the sun dipped low in the sky, he turned off the highway and pulled into a small, run-down motel. "We'll stay here tonight," he said, glancing over at Anne. "Just for a few hours. We need to rest." And nodded silently, her face pale and drawn. David felt a pang of guilt as he watched her. She was too young to be dealing with this, too young to carry the weight of their family's shattered past. But there was no turning back now. They were in this together. They checked in and made their way to the small, dingy room. David double-checked the locks and set up a makeshift alarm on the door before collapsing onto one of the beds, and sat on the other, her gaze fixed on the notebook in her hands. "Do you think Mom was scared?" she asked suddenly, her voice small and hesitant. David's heart twisted. "I think she was brave," he said softly. "She knew the risks, but she did it anyway because she loved you. She wanted to protect you." And nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I miss her so much. I wish I could talk to her, ask her why she did it, why she didn't tell me the truth." David sat up, his voice gentle. "She did what she thought was best. She didn't want you to be afraid, to feel like you were always looking over your shoulder. She wanted you to have a chance at a normal life." And shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "But it wasn't normal. I was always afraid, always wondering why we moved so much, why she wouldn't let me do things other kids did. I thought it was because of me, because I wasn't good enough." David felt his heart break at her words. "It was never about you, Anne. It was about keeping you safe. She loved you more than anything in the world. Everything she did was to protect you." And wiped at her eyes, her voice trembling. "I just wish I could have told her that I understood, that I loved her too." David moved to sit beside her, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "She knew, Anne. I promise you, she knew." They sat there for a long time, the quiet of the room wrapping around them like a blanket. For the first time in days, David felt a sense of peace, a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, they would get through this. But that peace was shattered when his phone buzzed on the bedside table. He picked it up, his heart sinking as he saw Michael's name on the screen. "David, where are you?" Michael's voice was tense, urgent. "We're at a motel off the highway, about an hour from the city," David replied, his stomach churning with dread. "Why? What's going on?" "There's been a leak," Michael said, his voice tight. "Sinclair knows you have the notebook. He's put out a hit on you and Anne. You need to get out of there now." David's blood ran cold. How did he find out? "I don't know," Michael said, his voice strained. "But it doesn't matter. You need to move, David. Go somewhere safe. I'll contact you when I have more information." David hung up, his mind racing. He turned to Anne, who was watching him with wide, frightened eyes. "We have to go," he said, his voice steady despite the panic clawing at his chest. "Now," and nodded, grabbing her bag. They left the motel quickly, their footsteps echoing in the still night air. David's heart pounded as they got into the car and sped away, his mind working furiously to figure out their next move. They drove in silence, the tension between them like a coiled spring. David knew they were running out of options, that they couldn't keep running forever. They needed a plan, and they needed one fast. As they drove, an idea began to form in his mind. Dangerous, desperate, but maybe their only chance. He glanced over at Anne, his voice low and serious. "We need to take this fight to him," he said, his words coming out in a rush. "We have the evidence, but it's not enough to just hand it over to the authorities. Sinclair has too many people in his pocket. We need to expose him in a way that he can't control." And frowned, her eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" David took a deep breath, his heart pounding. "We need to go public. Get the story out to the media, make it so big that he can't cover it up. If we can do that, he won't be able to touch us." Anne's eyes widened. "You mean like a press conference?" "Something like that," David said, his mind racing. "We'll need proof, people who can back up what we're saying. But if we can get it out there, make it impossible for him to silence us." And nodded slowly, the fear in her eyes giving way to determination. "Okay, let's do it." David felt a surge of pride as he looked at her. She was so strong, so brave. He knew they were taking a huge risk, but it was their best shot. They drove through the night, making their way back to the city. David's mind was a whirlwind of plans and possibilities, each more dangerous than the last. But he knew they were running out of time. When they finally reached Michael's office, he was waiting for them, his face drawn and tired. He ushered them inside, his voice low and urgent. "We don't have much time," he said, glancing nervously at the door. "I've contacted a few people in the media, people I trust. They're willing to help, but we need to move fast." David nodded, his heart pounding. "What do we need to do?" Michael handed him a folder, his expression grim. "This is everything we have on Sinclair, every crime, every connection. We need to put it all out there, make it impossible for him to deny." David took the folder, his hands shaking. This was it, their chance to finally bring Sinclair down. But as he looked at the papers, the weight of what they were about to do crashed down on him. "You're sure this will work?" he asked, his voice tight. "It has to," Michael said quietly. "It's the only way." They spent the next few hours preparing, going over every detail of their plan. David knew they were taking a huge risk, but it was the only way to stop Sinclair for good. When everything was ready, they made their way to the studio where the press conference would be held. The air was thick with tension, the room filled with reporters and cameras, all waiting for the story that would change everything. David stood at the podium, his heart pounding as he looked out at the sea of faces. This was it, the moment that would decide everything. He took a deep breath, his voice steady as he began to speak. "My name is David Weston," he said, his voice echoing through the silent room. "And I have a story to tell you. A story about corruption, about betrayal, and about the people who have risked everything to bring the truth to light." He held up the notebook, his hands trembling slightly. "This is the story of Kenneth Sinclair and the crimes he has committed. And today, we're going to make sure that the world knows the truth." As he spoke, he saw the cameras flashing, the reporters scribbling notes. He saw the looks of shock and outrage on their faces as he laid out the evidence, as he told Laura's story, as he showed them the proof of Sinclair's crimes. When he finished, the room erupted in a frenzy of questions and shouts. David stepped back, his heart pounding. He had done it. They had done it. But as he looked over at Anne, the fear in her eyes told him that this was far from over. Because now, the real battle was about to begin. The aftermath of the press conference was a whirlwind. David and Anne were whisked away by Michael and his team, escorted to a secure location as the media firestorm they had unleashed spread like wildfire. Every major news outlet was covering the story, broadcasting the details of Sinclair's crimes to millions of viewers. For the first time, David felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they had a chance to win this. But that hope was quickly overshadowed by fear. As they huddled in the small, dimly lit room that served as their temporary safe house, David's phone buzzed with a flood of messages. Some were from friends and former colleagues expressing shock and support, but others were more ominous, thinly veiled threats, warnings to back off before it was too late. And sat on the edge of the bed, her face pale as she watched the news coverage on the small television. David could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the fear that still lingered despite their bold move. He sat beside her, placing a comforting arm around her shoulders. "We did it," he said softly, trying to infuse his voice with confidence he didn't entirely feel. "It's out there now. Sinclair can't hide anymore." And nodded, but her expression was tight. "But what if he doesn't care? What if he decides to come after us anyway?" David's heart ached at the worry in her voice. "We'll be ready," he promised. "We've got people watching our backs now. Michael has contacts in law enforcement, and the media is all over this. He can't touch us without drawing even more attention." But even as he spoke the words, he knew they were only partly true. Sinclair was desperate, dangerous. He wouldn't go down without a fight, and David knew they had to be ready for anything. That night, as they tried to get some rest, the sound of shattering glass jolted them both awake. David shot up, his heart hammering in his chest as he reached for the baseball bat he had placed beside the bed. "Stay here," he whispered to Anne, his voice tight with fear. "Don't move," and nodded, her eyes wide with terror, as David crept towards the door. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway outside, heavy and deliberate. He tightened his grip on the bat, his mind racing. They were trapped, with no way out but through the intruders who were already inside. He cracked the door open, peering out into the dimly lit hallway. Two men were moving towards the living room, their backs turned to him. He recognized them as the type Sinclair hired, dangerous, professional, and completely ruthless. David's heart pounded in his ears as he weighed his options. He knew he couldn't fight them both off, not with just a bat. He needed to get in out of there, but there was only one way to do that. He took a deep breath, then stepped into the hallway, swinging the bat with all his strength. It connected with a sickening thud against the first man's head, sending him crashing to the floor. The second man whirled around, pulling a gun from his jacket. "And run," David shouted, throwing himself at the man. The gun went off, the sound deafening in the confined space. Pain exploded in David's side, but he ignored it, grappling with the man, trying to keep him from aiming the gun at Anne. He saw her hesitate, her face pale with fear, and then she turned and bolted down the hallway towards the back exit. David struggled with the man, his vision blurring as the pain in his side intensified. He felt himself weakening, the fight slipping out of him as the man twisted free, raising the gun. "Your little stunt is over," the man growled, his eyes cold. David braced himself, but before the man could pull the trigger, a loud crash echoed through the room. The man crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Michael stood behind him, a heavy metal lamp in his hands, his face pale with shock. "David, are you okay?" he asked, his voice shaking. David nodded weakly, his hand pressed to the wound in his side. "I'm fine. And where's Anne?" "She's outside," Michael said, helping him to his feet. "We need to get you both out of here." They stumbled out the back door, finding and huddled against the wall, her face streaked with tears. She rushed to David's side, her voice choked with fear. "Dad, you're bleeding." "I'm okay," David said, though the pain was almost unbearable. "We need to keep moving." Michael helped him into the car, his expression grim as he handed David a bundle of bandages. "We have to get you to a hospital." David shook his head, wincing as he tried to sit up. "No hospitals. Sinclair's got people everywhere. We can't risk it." Michael nodded reluctantly, turning to Anne. "There's a clinic a few miles from here. It's run by a friend of mine. We can trust him." They drove in silence, the tension in the car thick and suffocating. David's vision blurred with pain, his thoughts slipping in and out of focus. He could hear Anne's voice, could feel her hand gripping his, but everything else was a haze. When they finally arrived at the clinic, Michael helped him inside, calling out to a man in scrubs who looked up in surprise. "Charlie, we need help," Michael said urgently. "He's been shot." Charlie nodded, his expression serious as he guided them into a small exam room. "Lay him down. Let me see the wound." David winced as Charlie pulled up his shirt, revealing the blood-soaked bandages, and hovered nearby, her face pale and anxious. "Is he going to be okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. Charlie nodded as he worked, his hands moving quickly and efficiently. "It's not too deep. I can patch him up, but he needs to rest. No more running around like this." David tried to protest, but Charlie silenced him with a stern look. "You're no good to anyone if you're dead. You need to rest." David nodded reluctantly, his head spinning as the adrenaline began to wear off. He felt Anne's hand slip into his, her touch a lifeline in the swirling darkness. "Stay with me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm not going anywhere." As the sedative took hold, David's last thought was of Anne, of Laura, and of the promise he had made. He wouldn't stop, wouldn't give up, not until Sinclair was brought to justice. The darkness closed in, and he let it take him, knowing that when he woke, the fight would begin anew. David awoke to the soft murmur of voices. He blinked, his vision clearing slowly as he took in the small room around him, and was sitting beside him, her eyes red from crying, but she smiled when she saw he was awake. "Hey," she said softly, squeezing his hand. "You scared me." "Sorry," David murmured, his voice hoarse. "How long was I out?" "A few hours," Michael said, stepping into view. "You're lucky, David. A little to the left, and it would have hit your lung." David nodded, trying to sit up, but the pain in his side flared, and he sank back onto the bed with a groan. "What's the situation?" "Sinclair's people are looking for you," Michael said grimly. The press conference rattled him, but he's not done. He's going to fight this every step of the way. David closed his eyes, frustration boiling inside him. "We need to keep the pressure on. We have to make sure the story stays in the headlines." Michael nodded. "I've got people working on that. But you need to rest, David. Let us handle this for now." David wanted to argue, but he knew Michael was right. He needed to be at full strength if they were going to finish this. He looked at Anne, her face pale but determined. "I'm proud of you," he said softly. "You've been so strong through all of this." Anne's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, her voice steady. "We're going to finish this, Dad. Together." David smiled, a surge of love and pride filling his chest. They were in this together, and he knew they would see it through, no matter what it took. David's recovery was slow, but his resolve only grew stronger. Every day he spent in the small clinic, he and Anne stayed updated on the fallout from the press conference. Sinclair was on the defensive, his lawyers scrambling to issue denials and counterclaims, but the evidence was damning. The media buzz was relentless, and public outrage was building. It felt like the tide was finally turning in their favor. But David knew better than to underestimate Sinclair. Desperation made men dangerous, and Sinclair was more dangerous than ever. After 3 days, David was ready to get back in the fight. He insisted on leaving the clinic, despite Charlie's protests. With Michael's help, they moved to a new safe house, a small, nondescript apartment on the outskirts of the city. It was cramped and sparse, but it was secure, and for now, that was all that mattered. And had been spending her days reaching out to the victims and families impacted by Sinclair's operations, gathering statements and testimonials. She had found a new sense of purpose, a fire that burned brighter with each story she heard. David watched her with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. She was so strong, so determined, but he hated that she had to bear this burden. One evening, as they sat together in the small living room, Michael arrived with a look of grim determination. "I've got something," he said, dropping a folder onto the coffee table. A lead on Sinclair's next move. David leaned forward, wincing as the pain in his side flared. "What is it?" Michael opened the folder, revealing a series of photographs and documents. "Sinclair's planning to disappear. He's got a private jet on standby at a small airfield outside the city. If he gets on that plane, we'll never see him again." Anne's eyes widened. "When?" "Tomorrow night," Michael replied. "We have a small window to stop him. If we miss it, he's gone." David's mind raced. If Sinclair fled the country, everything they had worked for would be for nothing. They had to stop him, but he knew it wouldn't be easy. "What's the security like?" he asked, his voice steady. "Tight," Michael admitted. "His men will be everywhere, and he's got contacts at the airfield. We'll need to move fast and quiet if we're going to get to him before he takes off." David nodded, his mind already formulating a plan. "We need to split up. Michael, you handle the airfield security. Make sure we have a clear path to the plane. And then I will get inside and confront Sinclair." Anne's eyes widened. "Dad, no. It's too dangerous. You're still hurt." "I'm fine," David said firmly, cutting her off. "This is our best chance to stop him. We can't let him get away." And hesitated, her face pale with fear. "But what if something happens? What if—" "Nothing's going to happen," David said gently, taking her hand. "We've come too far to let him win now. We're going to finish this together." And swallowed hard, then nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "Okay, let's do it." They spent the rest of the night preparing, going over the plan again and again until every detail was etched into their minds. Michael secured a van and the necessary equipment, and by dawn, they were ready. The drive to the airfield was tense and silent. David's heart pounded as he glanced over at Anne, her face set with grim determination. He wanted to tell her everything would be okay, that they would come out of this unscathed, but he couldn't bring himself to lie. They were walking into the lion's den, and he knew the odds were against them. When they arrived at the airfield, they parked the van a short distance away, using the cover of the surrounding trees to approach the perimeter. Michael checked in with his contact, then gave them the signal. "Security's down," he whispered. "You're clear to move in." David nodded, his heart racing as he turned to Anne. "Stay close to me, and whatever happens, don't stop. We get to Sinclair, and we end this." And nodded, her eyes fierce. "I'm ready." They slipped through the fence and made their way towards the hangar where Sinclair's plane was waiting. The air was thick with tension, every shadow seeming to hide a threat. David's mind raced as they crept closer, his senses on high alert. As they reached the hangar, David saw Sinclair's men standing guard at the entrance. He took a deep breath, then signaled to and to wait. He moved quickly, taking out the first guard with a swift strike to the head. The second turned, his eyes widening in surprise. But before he could react, David knocked him out cold and moved up beside him, her face pale but determined. "Let's go." They slipped inside the hangar, the massive plane looming ahead of them like a dark shadow. Sinclair was there, surrounded by a few of his top men, his face set in a mask of fury and fear. David felt a surge of satisfaction at the sight. He had never seen Sinclair look so rattled, so desperate. "This is it," David whispered to Anne. "We're going to finish this." They moved forward, their footsteps silent on the concrete floor. David's heart pounded as they closed the distance, his mind focused on one thing, taking Sinclair down, no matter what. But as they stepped into the open, Sinclair turned, his eyes narrowing as he spotted them. His lips curled into a sneer. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "The prodigal father and daughter. I must say, I didn't expect you to get this far. Impressive." "Give it up, Sinclair," David said, his voice steady. "It's over. You're not getting on that plane." Sinclair laughed, the sound cold and mocking. "You really think you've won, don't you? You think this little stunt of yours is going to bring me down?" He gestured to his men, who raised their guns, training them on David and Anne. David's heart pounded, but he kept his voice calm. "Drop the guns," he said, his tone firm. This doesn't have to end in bloodshed. Sinclair smirked, shaking his head. Oh, but it does. You've made this very personal, David. And I don't like loose ends. David tensed, his mind racing. They were outnumbered, outgunned. But he couldn't back down now, not when they were so close. Dad, and whispered, her voice tight with fear. What do we do? David glanced around, his eyes landing on a stack of crates nearby. An idea formed, dangerous and desperate, but it was their only chance. Run, he whispered to Anne. On my signal, run to the crates and take cover. Anne's eyes widened. No, I'm not leaving you. Do it, David said firmly. I'll be right behind you. Before Anne could protest, David turned back to Sinclair, his voice strong and steady. You're done, Sinclair. We have everything we need to take you down. Sinclair's eyes flashed with anger. You think you can stop me? You're nothing, David. You and your daughter are just collateral damage. David's heart pounded as he saw Sinclair's finger tighten on the trigger. He took a deep breath, then shouted, now, and run, and bolted towards the crates, and David lunged forward, tackling Sinclair to the ground. The gun went off, the shot echoing through the hangar, but David didn't stop. He wrestled with Sinclair, his mind a blur of adrenaline and fear. Sinclair's men shouted, their guns trained on David, but before they could fire, the doors burst open, and Michael's team stormed in, guns blazing. Chaos erupted. Bullets flew, men shouted, and David struggled to hold Sinclair down, his heart pounding as the world exploded around him. Get off me, you bastard. Sinclair snarled, his voice filled with rage. David tightened his grip, his voice low and fierce. It's over, Sinclair. You're going to pay for everything you've done. But Sinclair twisted, his hand reaching for a hidden knife. David saw the blade flash, felt the sharp pain as it sliced across his arm. He grunted, his vision blurring as he struggled to hold on. Then, suddenly, Sinclair was wrenched away, and David looked up to see Anne standing over him, her face pale but determined. Stay down, she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. David nodded, his heart swelling with pride and love as he watched her. She had saved him, again. She was stronger than he could have ever imagined. But the fight wasn't over yet. Sinclair's men were regrouping, their guns trained on Michael's team. David knew they couldn't hold out much longer. Michael, he shouted, his voice hoarse. Get out of here. Take it and go. But Michael shook his head, his eyes blazing with determination. Not without you. David struggled to his feet, his body screaming in pain. We don't have time. Before he could finish, a loud explosion rocked the hangar, the force of it throwing them all to the ground. David's ears rang, his vision blurring as he struggled to make sense of what was happening. Then he saw it, a plume of smoke rising from the far end of the hangar, where Sinclair's plane had been parked. The plane was engulfed in flames, the heat of the fire searing the air. Sinclair was on his knees, his face twisted with rage and fear. No, he shouted, his voice raw with desperation. You can't do this. David staggered forward, his heart pounding as he realized what had happened. Michael's team had rigged the plane, destroyed Sinclair's escape route. He was trapped. It's over, Sinclair, David said, his voice steady. There's nowhere left for you to run. Sinclair turned, his eyes wild with fury. You think this is over? You have no idea who you're dealing with, David. I'll burn your world to the ground. David shook his head, his voice calm and resolute. You've already lost. Sinclair lunged at him, but Michael's team was on him in an instant, pinning him to the ground. David watched, his heart pounding, as they cuffed Sinclair, hauling him to his feet. It's over, Michael said, his voice filled with satisfaction. You're going to prison for a long time, Sinclair. Sinclair spat on the ground, his eyes blazing with hatred. You think you've won? This isn't over. It's never over. But David knew better. He looked at Anne, her face streaked with dirt and tears, and he knew they had done it. They had brought Sinclair down. They had won. The days following Sinclair's capture were a blur. David and Anne were placed under tight security, relocated to a new safe house as the legal system moved swiftly to dismantle Sinclair's empire. The evidence they had presented, Laura's notebook, the testimonials from victims, and the damning records of Sinclair's operations, was overwhelming. The media coverage was relentless, and public outrage was palpable. For the first time in years, David felt a sense of relief, a hope that maybe they had finally turned the tide. But the cost of victory weighed heavily on him. Sinclair might be behind bars, but the scars of the battle they had fought would linger long after the cameras stopped rolling. As the media storm began to calm, Michael arranged a private meeting between David and the lead prosecutor on Sinclair's case. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Carla Rivera, wasted no time getting to the point. "Mr. Weston, Ms. Collins," she began, her voice firm but compassionate. "I want to thank you both for your courage. Your actions have brought down one of the most dangerous criminal organizations we've ever faced. But I need to be honest with you, this isn't over. Sinclair has allies, people who will try to retaliate. You're still at risk." David felt a chill run down his spine, but he nodded. "We knew the risks. We're prepared to do whatever it takes." Carla nodded, her expression softening. "We're going to provide you with new identities and a secure location. You'll be safe, but you'll need to disappear for a while." Anne's eyes widened. "You mean we have to leave? Go into hiding?" Carla's gaze was sympathetic. "It's the only way to ensure your safety. Once Sinclair's trial is over and his network is dismantled, we can reassess. But for now, it's the best option." David looked at Anne, his heart aching at the thought of uprooting their lives again. But he knew Carla was right. They had come too far, fought too hard, to lose everything now. "We'll do it," he said quietly. "Whatever it takes to stay safe." And nodded slowly, her face pale but resolute. "Okay, if it's what we have to do, we'll do it." Over the next few days, they prepared to leave their old lives behind. New documents were issued, their names and histories were written. It felt surreal, erasing the past they had fought so hard to reclaim, but David knew it was the only way to protect and to give them both a chance at a future free from fear. The night before they were set to leave, David found himself unable to sleep. He wandered out to the small balcony of their safe house, the cool night air soothing against his skin. He stared out at the city lights, his mind a whirl of thoughts and emotions. So much had changed in such a short time. He had found his daughter, fought to protect her, and now they were starting over again, their future uncertain. But they were alive, and they were together, and that was what mattered. He turned as he heard the door creak open, and then stepped out, wrapping her arms around herself against the chill. "Can't sleep?" she asked softly. David shook his head, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Too much on my mind," and nodded, leaning against the railing beside him. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of everything unsaid between them. "Are you scared?" and asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. David hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I am, but not for me. I'm scared for you. I'm scared that after everything we've been through, I won't be able to protect you." And looked up at him, her eyes shining with tears. "You have protected me, Dad. You've done everything you could, and more. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for you." David felt his heart swell with love and pride. He reached out, pulling her into a tight hug. "I'm so proud of you, and you're stronger than I ever could have imagined." They held each other for a long time, the bond between them stronger than ever. David knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they had faced worse and come through it together. They could handle this. The next morning, they left the city in a nondescript car, their new identities and destination kept secret even from Michael. The drive was long and quiet, the weight of what they were leaving behind heavy in the air. As they crossed state lines and the landscape changed from city to countryside, David felt a strange sense of peace. They were moving forward, leaving the darkness of the past behind them. Their new home was a small, secluded house in a quiet town far from the chaos they had known. It was simple, unassuming, the perfect place to start over. David and it settled in, adjusting to their new identities, their new lives. The days passed slowly, the tension gradually easing as they adapted to their new reality. David found a job at a local hardware store, and it enrolled in online classes, her thirst for knowledge and growth undiminished despite everything they had been through. One afternoon, as they were unpacking the last of their boxes, and found a small photo album tucked away in one of Laura's old bags. She sat down on the floor, flipping through the pages, her eyes soft with nostalgia. "Dad, look," she said, holding up a photo. It was a picture of David and Laura, taken years ago, their faces alight with happiness. David sat beside her, his heart aching as he looked at the photo. "That was the day we moved into our first house," he said softly. "We had no idea what we were doing, but we were so happy," and smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. "I wish I could have known her, really known her. She was so brave." David reached out, squeezing her hand. "She would be so proud of you, Anne. You've got her strength, her spirit. You're everything she dreamed you'd be." They sat together, flipping through the album, sharing memories and stories. For the first time in a long time, David felt a sense of peace, a hope that maybe, just maybe, they could build a new life, a life free from the shadows of the past. As the weeks turned into months, that hope grew. The trial against Sinclair moved forward, the evidence they had gathered unraveling his empire piece by piece. His associates were arrested, his assets seized. Justice was being served, and the threat that had loomed over them for so long began to fade. But the scars remained. There were nights when David would wake in a cold sweat, the memories of the battles they had fought crashing over him like a wave. And, too, had her moments, her dreams haunted by the faces of those they had lost, the terror they had faced. But they faced those fears together, leaning on each other, finding strength in the bond they had forged. They were a family, broken but healing, and that was something Sinclair could never take away. One crisp autumn morning, David and Anne took a walk through the small town, the air filled with the scent of fallen leaves and the sounds of children playing. They stopped at a small cafe, ordering coffee and pastries, enjoying the simple pleasure of a quiet morning. As they sat at a small table by the window, David looked at his daughter, her face peaceful and content. She had grown so much, come so far, and he couldn't be prouder. "What do you think?" he asked, a smile tugging at his lips. "Think we can make this work?" And looked around, her eyes soft and thoughtful. "Yeah," she said quietly, "I think we can." David reached across the table, taking her hand. "We've been through hell and back, but we're still here. We're still fighting."